That's right. I remember.
That's good. You, no matter what. Go ahead, drink your coffee.
No, I was remembering a time on a Friday in the summer we were visiting in Hal, and the doctor called in to tell me about a patient he wanted to transfer here. And I was about the only doc. I was working with one PA, running all over the place. So the phone answers, and someone answers the phone and calls for me. So it's a little while for me to break free and get back to pick up the phone. And as I pick up the phone, the guy on the other end of the phone is obviously talking away from the phone to someone else in his office. And that's the MVA doctors. All they sit around and do all day is drink coffee. So I pick up the phone and I said, "Hi, Dr. Fisher here. I'm awfully sorry I've been so late, but I spilled a cup of coffee without breaking to the phone."
Ready?
You're on. Go ahead.
Okay. It is part of the Greater Capital District teaching grant entitled "Its Time Has Come, Supplementary Materials for Teaching the Vietnam War." We have the pleasure of sitting in the VA hospital this afternoon with Dr. Jeff Fisher. Dr. Fisher, we certainly want to thank you. First of all, I should do this at the end. I don't know why I did it at the beginning. No, that's all right. We want to thank you very much for taking your time this afternoon to spend a couple minutes with us. Could you maybe just get into it by briefly explaining your role at the VA hospital?
When the issue of we're going to be talking about Agent Orange in this segment, and when the issue first came up, at least to the point where the VA had to address the question, they created a group of individuals and made them aware of the problems with Agent Orange, and created in each facility what was called an environmental physician, and usually that fell to the outpatient department, since much of the work that was subsequently to occur, occurred in the outpatient department. Initially, we were all called down to Washington and briefed on the question of Agent Orange and what the VA planned on doing about it at the various institutions throughout the country. The question of Agent Orange goes back quite a ways, and the question of the use of herbicides in a war theater goes back actually to World War II. Herbicides had been developed in the 30s. These were chemicals that they found to be active biologically and cause vegetation and weeds essentially to dry up and die. The original use of herbicides was planned for agriculture, but the military became interested in it and essentially called some of the original investigators and brought them down to the Maryland area and set them up and sponsored their research. They began to think of the military potential for it, but by the early 40s, as the research got going, nothing really happened before the end of World War II. And as a result, the idea of the use of herbicides in military operations was abandoned. However, the original basis for the research continued, and throughout the 40s and 50s, great numbers of herbicides were developed and used throughout the country. I point this out now because later this was to have some interesting ripple effect in terms of the research that was going on. The effect of herbicides is to cause the plant to metabolize at a great rate of speed, something similar to hyperthyroid in a human being. the roots develop nodules, the leaves begin to fall off the plant, and it withers. The uses for the herbicides domestically, prior to their introduction in the Vietnam War, was to clear the right-of-way of roads on the side to keep down the foliage there. It was used along power lines to cut swaths in the vegetation along these lines. It was used to keep down certain forms of plants in water. Certain chemicals had more specific effect for conifers, other herbicides had more specific effects for deciduous trees, and so forth. It was used in agriculture, and the components of the Agent Orange that we're going to be talking about have been used for 30 years in this country, and it wasn't until 1979 that one of the components of Agent Orange, of which there are two, was banned. And more recently, the second component was banned, but still finds its place on shelves where stocks have not been completely sold out. The Vietnam War was taken over by the Americans after the fall of Dien Bien Phu, and in the following decade, very little happened until about the early 60s, when things began to build up again. And the idea of using an herbicide in this jungle environment resurfaced. The Agent Orange program, or the use of herbicides, began formally in 1962 and were sprayed over Vietnam for the next 9 years. Discontinued in 1971. What they found was that, again, as domestically they needed to clear roadway, the convoys and troop movements along the roads in Vietnam were constantly being harassed by sniper fire, and if they could keep down the vegetation to a significant degree on either side of the road, they felt that the attacks would be less numerous, the enemy would be less brave about coming so far out to get decent shots at our troops. The other aspect of defoliation was to clear the river sides, and the third aspect of it was to open up jungle areas. You may have heard of the underground cities that the Viet Cong had developed, and these were heavily covered by jungle foliage, which protected their observation from the air. After a spraying of Agent Orange, these areas at least could be viewed to some extent or anticipated, and countermeasures taken. The effects of Agent Orange would last for several months before new foliage would grow up. The Agent Orange was brought in, a large number brought into to Da Nang and other ports of entry in Vietnam. From there, and they would come in these 55-gallon tanks that most of us are familiar with an orange stripe around it, and that gave it its name, or its name was given to the orange stripe. The Agent Orange was then distributed in several different ways. The perimeters of fire-base camps were sprayed much in the same way as we would use a garden sprayer, various chemicals, carried on backpacks and sprayed through nozzles. This kept the foliage down around the camps, again to keep sniper fire down, or at least to discourage it. The larger use of Agent Orange was sprayed from the air, either from helicopters or from other types of planes. They had taken a C-123 cargo plane and installed it with a 500-gallon tank and ran lines out on the wings, on booms, and also from the rear of the plane. And this would then, planes would take off to a described area. Generally, they would fly in the morning out of the sun, so that their approach would in some way be less detected. And they would fly in formation, perhaps 6 planes, and at relatively low altitude, and release their 500 gallons. This would take about 8 minutes to do, and would cut a swath about a quarter to a half of a mile when it finally landed. This was the nature of the operation. Perhaps 1/10 of the country by the end of the war had been sprayed with Agent Orange. And if you look at the spraying records, certain areas were sprayed as much as 4 times. About 100 million gallons of this stuff was sprayed over the course of the 9-year period of its usage. So that is the way Agent Orange found its way into Vietnam. And after the war, most of the people in the military then become veterans. And any of the wounds that are received in the service, any of the medical problems that develop in the service, perhaps not even related to the service in any way, but merely discovered at the time a person was in the service, are addressed by the Veterans Administration. This agency is the second largest government agency, secondary to the Department of Defense, which supplies us with our clientele. The Veterans Administration was established in 1930 to take care of veterans who had borne the battle, and over the years it's evolved to the point where it has 172 medical centers serving about 14 million veterans. There's some rough figures. The veterans can be admitted to the Veterans Hospital for any medical problem if they're honorably discharged servicemen. Outpatient services were somewhat more restricted, and as a consequence of lobbying efforts, the VA has both grown, and the services and eligibility for veterans has been expanded over the years since the very beginning of the VA. The issue of Agent Orange in the VA didn't really come to a head until about '78. And it came to the forefront in a rather interesting way. A claims clerk in Chicago had begun to hear what became a recurrent type of history of veterans complaining of weakness, malaise, numbness, headaches, irritability, gastrointestinal complaints. And at some point asked the question whether exposure to Agent Orange had anything to do with this. One of the contaminants in Agent Orange is a substance or collection of substances called dioxin. Dioxin refers to a chemical structure, and there are about 70 different types of dioxin, but the one that was produced as a contaminant in the production of one of the components of Agent Orange is one of the most toxic substances known to man. And this particular substance was present in an herbicide that was used domestically. And as a result of some of the questions that were raised domestically regarding the safety or health hazard of dioxin, was thought to be a possible substance responsible for the collection of symptoms that our Vietnam veterans were complaining about. The arguments for this grew until in 1979 the Veterans Administration decided that they had to deal with this program. In fact, it was the Congress that determines what we do, and the Congress, through legislation, determined that we, the Veterans Administration, will deal with this problem. Originally, that took the form of a offering of examination to any veteran who was exposed to Agent Orange. And in the history of this, it's very interesting. The gains along Agent Orange have mostly been legal and political rather than medical, and this remains the case. The first achievement, if you will, part of veterans was that it became apparent, even though we knew where the military could supply us with spraying records, they weren't all that accurate. The troop movements over the country weren't all that accurate. The exposure of these veterans wasn't all that adequate and accurate. As a consequence of it, it was decided that anyone who was in country in Vietnam was potentially exposed to Agent Orange. And that, of course, took the burden off the veteran trying to prove where he was and where things were, where Agent Orange was sprayed. The veteran only had to be in country and then could receive what the VA developed as a registry of patients, wherein the veteran came to the VA hospital, was given a questionnaire as to the possibility of exposure and the amount and to what, whether family was affected, whether children were born with birth defects, whether there had been any cancers in the veteran. And then we're given an examination and routine types of blood tests. The test for dioxin could not be done at that time, and to this date, although it can be done, we can get into that a little later, its significance was questionable. The Registry of Veterans now has over 250,000 examinations in them. It's interesting in that, as I mentioned, everyone is eligible for these examinations, and we know that there were 2.6 million veterans in Vietnam, so that what we're seeing is essentially only a tenth of the number of individuals who could possibly have such an examination. This particular registry was originally called an epidemiological study, but because there were no controls in this, it really couldn't be called a very nice, in the true sense of the word nice, study. As a consequence, you could only get a sense of whether one was in fact seeing an increased incidence of any particular disease. The use of the information that we got when finally analyzed did not seem to indicate an increase in the mortality of the Vietnam veterans, though there has been, subsequent to that, an increased incidence of suicides and violent deaths in the veteran population. That's interesting information, but may not be in any way related to Agent Orange. The Vietnam veterans continued to lobby for more benefits and more studies with respect to Agent Orange. And service connection for certain conditions. And in order to talk about the medical aspects of Agent Orange, you have to look at the difference between what we know and what we've learned about the side effects, not so much of Agent Orange, but particularly focusing when we talk on Agent Orange about dioxin. Both of the components, you have to understand, are toxins at perhaps on a scale of 10, a level of 3. But the dioxin contaminant, in terms of toxicity, is a toxicity that would be about 9. And this is what causes the greatest concern. The information on what we would expect to have as diseases produce dioxin is not really known at a low-level exposure. There have never been any good studies relative to low-level exposure. Most of the information that we have on dioxin comes from high-level, short-duration exposures. These came as a result of industrial accidents where the product being produced, which also produced dioxin as a contaminant, were subjected to runaway reactions, and that there were chemical explosions with industrial workers exposed briefly to very high doses of of dioxin. And it's from the medical consequences of those industrial accidents that we know much about what we know about dioxin and its health effects. One of the health effects that we know about was a condition called chloracne. Another one is porphyria. And another one is toxic effects of, on the liver. There have been other effects reported in acute exposures, including cystitis, kidney disease, blood disorders, and disorders in the immunology. But the most clear-cut ones are those of porphyria and of chloracne. Chloracne is a condition that produces acne-like skin lesions, and it tends to occur on the exposed areas of the face and around the ears. The chloracne tends to persist for a period of months to years. In fact, an industrial explosion that took place in 1941, there are people that have residual of chloracne even at this point, 40, 50 years later now. But most of the chloracne tends to go away within a period of about 6 years maximum. The other areas of exposure, you might have read about Times Beach, and there was contaminants. A number of people developed problems with hemorrhagic cystitis, that's bleeding from the bladder, and the blood's picked up in the urine. That tended to reverse itself. There were two concerns that veterans had, mostly, and those were the unseen. It seemed in looking at these patients that they could deal with what they had, but they couldn't deal with the unknown. And the unknown in this case took two forms. One, cancers, and two, the effects on the unborn. And I can remember when we first got started with the issue of Agent Orange here in the VA, that people were raising the question, well, now I'm back from the war. It's 10 years later now that we're talking about. The average vet at this time was about 30 years old, had been back in the country, likely 8 to 10 years or a little bit more, was settling down in life, had a job, had a wife, were considering family. And the question of the effects of Agent Orange, dioxin, was a real issue for them. It wasn't uncommon for a vet to ask me, well, what do you think about having children? That was a very difficult, question to answer. And it was difficult because it was quite clear that at the very best, it was clear to me that at that time, the experiment that our veterans unwittingly got into was not a very good one. It didn't have controls. And even in very good experiments where there are controls and a very controlled environment, sometimes the results are not that clear-cut. So it was hard for me to believe that I could tell a veteran, well, wait a year or two, and we'll be able to give you the answer. For the wives of these individuals and the patients themselves, the biological clock was ticking away, and people who wanted to have a family while they were still young, it was kind of difficult for them and for me to advise them to put it off. The Veterans Administration then was interested in doing as many studies as they could to resolve this question. And the CDC, the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, did a rather large study involving 6,000 to 8,000 births around the Atlanta area where the CDC is stationed, if you will, headquartered, in an effort to look at the number of abnormal births on a case-by-case basis, and then ask the question, were these births the product of a marriage of a Vietnam veteran, or whether they were not? And so they set up controls, and what they found was that there really wasn't a significant difference in the number of abnormal births produced by Vietnam veteran parents as opposed to non-Vietnam veteran parents. There were a couple of areas where if you threw the data together, you could find a slight increase. And that really called for additional testing. But the incidence of this was very small, and the types of malformations, dermatological and as far as palates, cleft palates were concerned, was about as significant an abnormality that they came up with where it was seen in greater incidence in the Vietnam veteran. The question of cancers was another unknown for the veterans and a source of concern. And several studies were looked at to see whether there was an increased incidence in cancer. The impetus for this came again from industrial accidents, again, large exposures, and also some studies that were done in Germany and in Sweden among railroad workers who were exposed to the herbicides by virtue of their work. And some of the studies suggested that there was an increased incidence of stomach cancer and an increased incidence of lymphoma, a cancer of the lymph system. Additional studies were done by several states, New York and Massachusetts being one. And the results in some of the studies showed as high as a six-fold increase in risk. What they tried to do in many of these studies was to establish a risk factor, and that was based on what the possibility of the level of exposure of any given veteran was. This was very difficult to do, and I don't think anyone is really satisfied that it was very precisely done. But the question of lymphoma remains in our minds as a possibility whose incidence is increased by the exposure of veterans to Agent Orange / Dioxin. Some more studies are being done. The Veterans Administration and the veteran lobby groups are lobbying for service connection for lymphoma. And that's about the state of the medical state of the art as far as dioxin is concerned. A great deal of research was done and on this question, but at this point there are fewer and fewer human studies being done on the population of veterans, and the reason for that is that the data isn't getting any purer, that it's not being refined in any way that can make the results any more accurate than they already are. I have to mention a study that was done by the Department of Defense, and early on this particular study showed the greatest promise. As I mentioned, they're frustrated by not knowing what the exposure was. The original operation for spraying Agent Orange was called Ranch Hand, and it involved about 2,000 Air Force personnel, some of which, if you talk to them, will tell you they just slopped around in this stuff as if they were bathing in it. So, at least with that particular group of patients, veterans, if you will, there's a pretty good chance of a significant exposure. The result of that indicated no increased incidence in mortality and no particular increased incidence in any disease entity. The other interesting thing, oddly enough, was that there was a lower incidence of cardiovascular disease. Again, nobody can really explain that at this point, but that indeed did come out of it. Along the political and legal lines, there were a number of class action suits, one of which was lodged against the government, and there's a law on the books that doesn't allow you to sue the government. The idea was that, and so the veterans then turned their lawsuits towards the private sector, the one of several companies producing dioxin for the government. The initial response was, we produced a decent product, but it wasn't used in the proper way. Of course, it was being produced for home use, so it really never did have a proper way to be administered on a foreign country as part of a war effort. But in any event, the lawsuit went through, and ultimately the veterans were awarded, I believe, about $240 million as a resolution. Nobody quite knew what to do with all this money, so it was invested, and it's since grown to great proportion. There are going to be individual awards made to veterans who are ill, and large block grants out of this are going to be given to programs that will help Vietnam veterans and family members who are in some way handicapped. Mind you, there's no admission at this point that any of the handicapped or patients with psychological problems, that they were related in any way to Agent Orange. But I think, considering the difficulty of trying to get some resolution, that this is possibly the best way that the funds could be used. They're being turned back on the Vietnam veteran and used in his and hers and their family's advantage. I think, in looking at it, in perspective, the issue of Agent Orange is somewhat larger than its chemical and medical reality. The Vietnam veteran was in fact a disenfranchised group of veterans, and needed at some point to be able to latch on to something that would be a rallying point. And this is not to say that Agent Orange, dioxin, is not an issue. It's a very real one. But it also provided a rallying point for the veterans to finally be recognized. And I think it's through Agent Orange and getting veterans in for examination that we have not only helped in making the Agent Orange issue more than a symbol, but a reality. In the process of all these examinations, we have seen a population, an age group population that the VA, in a greater proportion than the VA had ever seen in previous veteran groups, Korea, World War II. The age group was younger, and we saw problems of a different nature. The other thing was that in an age group that normally is a healthy age group, we in fact did find some diseases that require treatment, and the expanded eligibility of being a Vietnam veteran exposed to Agent Orange gave us the opportunity to treat these conditions, and that of course was good for the veteran. One of the things that surfaced that was very interesting, and I don't think it would have surfaced as soon, is the condition of post-traumatic stress disorder, which at the time began to be considered, was questioned. There's no question in my mind, after a decade of seeing patients who suffer from this disorder, that it's very significant. I'm surprised that even now, 20 years after the war, that patients with PTSD are still coming out of the woodwork. And I don't think this would have occurred without the issue of Agent Orange, without the VA being forced to be involved in it, without the emergence of a Vietnam veteran who could begin to express the complaints that they had, and once again join the human race, if you will, so that, you know, there isn't an ill wind that doesn't blow some good, and Dioxin was in this wind, and Agent Orange was in this wind, and to some degree it's had a positive effect. In closing, I'm not sure that we will ever be able to know as a result of the veterans that we have, what health effects or health complaints that the veterans have are or aren't related to Agent Orange. But we still continue to treat the patients with Agent Orange. In a recent publication, from VA Central Office. We are now instructed to retain the records of any veteran complaining or of exposure to Agent Orange, and again, that's any Vietnam in-country veteran, for a period of 75 years, which of course is the lifetime of the veteran, so that anything that may emerge with respect to the health effects of Agent Orange will be part of a perpetual record. And should any awards, any conclusions come from these studies, the veterans will be able to seek whatever redress is available to them.
It's a fantastic presentation. The questions I have are just, I don't know if they're worth asking. One short one is, when you use the phrase Agent Orange, is that a generic word for lots of different herbicides that were used?
Agent Orange was made up of 2,4,5-T and 2,4-D. Phenoxyacetic acids, actually they're esters. And that, in a 50-50 proportion, was Agent Orange. Now there were other agents and herbicides that had different functions, some of which the veterans questioned too. The studies of those will be no nicer. Agent Orange was used 90% of the time. The other agents, the health effects may also be questioned, but again, if you don't produce a nice study with Agent Orange, which represented 90% of what was done, sure, not going to produce it with any of the other herbicides that were used. It is in the production of the 2,4,5-T that dioxin is produced. It has to do with the temperature and pressure that's needed to generate this particular molecule. And so, at some point earlier on, from 62 to 65, the production of 2,4,5-T was done in such a way that where there was an even greater concentration of dioxin. Subsequent to 65, the production technique was modified, and so there was less Agent Orange. The drug can be toxic to animals in levels as low as parts per trillion. So we're talking a significantly toxic substance. And if you look at the way they figured out the concentration of the contaminants, the dioxin, they figured that over the course of Vietnam, over the area of Vietnam, which I believe is 6 million square miles, there was a weight of dioxin, and everything that was sprayed over a 9-year period was 350 pounds. 350 pounds is what is worrying these people because it is so toxic.
Has it shown up, or has there been any evidence of any long-lasting effects within South Vietnam itself? Has there been any studies done over there?
That's a good question. Early on, there was a doctor, a Vietnamese doctor, who noticed a tremendous amount of what he considered an increased incidence of abortions and abnormal births. But it was uncontrolled. We couldn't get into Vietnam to try to verify what they were seeing. It's still believed that that's the case. But you're dealing in a war-torn area with a multiplicity of factors. It would be a very, very messy study to try to conduct.
Do you think it will be done?
Probably not. Probably not.
Is there any evidence it had a long-term effect on the vegetation, like animal life in South Vietnam, or is it the same kind of thing we just talked about?
If you look at, and early on when I started dealing with this, I had a lot more chemical knowledge in my head. But, and the veterans, of course, were very defensive. They were less defensive than the DoD, but the half-life of dioxin is very photo-degraded. Sunlight breaks it up very quickly, and in half-life of 6 hours. So it's gone if it stays on the surface. But if you're pushing the issue, you say, well, it gets, and a lot of it was wound up on the jungle canopy. So theoretically, gets absorbed into the plants, does its dirtiest, and some of which is gone. Well, what happens to the dying plants? Gets into the ground, gets into the aquifer shifts it to other areas. You deal in questions of what is absorbed, like a separation column, how far can it go, and all of a sudden you're in a conundrum, you just don't. And that's why the information it wasn't very good to begin with. It wasn't a study that was planned. It isn't going to get any better over time. It could get a little better over time when they talked about risk factors and relative risk and where you're going to go. But after that, there's no more information. That aspect of the study was closed. I might say that, because I alluded to it earlier, that the use of herbicide in the United States began in the 40s and continued through the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And when people said, well, let's test for it, the state of the art wasn't that good. It wasn't enough to determine dioxin, but you had to determine this particular type of dioxin, 2,3,7,8 tetrachloro dioxin. And so they originally did biopsies, fat soluble, so they did fat biopsies to see, well, what can we come up with? And what they came up with was they found it in doses in people, in levels in people that weren't in Vietnam. They found it in individuals who were in Vietnam and weren't symptomatic. They found none in Vietnam veterans, which would be expected if you didn't spray the entire area and people's exposure was limited. And so they said, well, what do we do with this information? And that satisfied people who wanted to bury the issue very well. We can't make anything of it. Forget it. But over the period of 10 years, they can now detect these specific dioxin in parts per trillion. And there was a study in New Jersey trying to relate blood levels to fat levels. A good idea, because a fat biopsy is a small procedure. A blood level is merely drawing blood. But irrespective of how sophisticated the determination, how and what minute quantities you can get Agent R or dioxin rather, and determine it in an individual, doesn't in any way allow you to say anything about it. Because what was true with the fat biopsies 10, 15 years ago is true now. What does it mean if you have used this substance domestically and you can pick it up in individuals? I think the only use it would really serve, and over time its levels drop down as it's ultimately metabolized and eliminated by the body. But what would be of most significance if you could tell a veteran who is worried about it that you have none in your body. Other than that, I don't know what else you can do with this information, other than perhaps do better studies. But originally it was cost prohibitive to do that. Now, with the equipment, it's less prohibitive, but I can understand people pushing for it. I don't think it would lead to anything that the scientific community would come up and back as far as, and that's my own opinion, but the scientific community would back as being the definitive study that was going to answer the question. Just at the outset, I looked at it and said, this is too bad. And it made counseling very difficult. But I think, if nothing else, that it's no gratification to me, but I think 10 years have proven that the counseling, and I was very reluctant to give at that time, which was to outline it and say, I don't think we're going to have the answer. You're going to have to believe in yourselves and do what works for you, and probably this will not be a problem. But it was a terrible responsibility because 2 births in 100 are abnormal. And if it's abnormal and there was a question of Agent Orange, it wasn't a question of Agent Orange. It was Agent Orange that caused this particular birth defect. And it remains that for individuals who had abnormal children before the issue came up. It's extremely traumatic psychologically to have an abnormal child. The sense of guilt is tremendous. And if you can look to some outside source to explain it, to be angry with, to take the sense of guilt and displace it, you do it. And so for those unfortunate individuals who in this period of time who potentially were exposed, who have abnormal children, I think for them it's the toughest. Of the 2 issues that I've seen in veterans and expressed, cancer and abnormal childbirth over the course of time were the ones that bothered them. These are brave men, can deal with anything they can see, and they sure did. But with the question of the unseen, that was difficult. And of the 2, it was the children that concerned them most, even before all the studies were done, because they could live with the cancer in themselves. They didn't have to feel guilty that they were responsible for it than someone else. It was theirs. It was their cross to bear.
15 minutes.
Is there any final words before we wrap it up? I really want to thank you. It's a super presentation.
You're more than welcome.
Any final thoughts?
I don't think so. I think that it will remain an issue for Vietnam veterans for as long as they live, that the gains that have been made politically are well deserved. The part that Agent Orange played in that is probably significant, but I think it would have occurred anyway. We, as a nation, had to deal with this war. And I think for 10 years or so, the only people that had to deal with it and suffer with it were the veterans themselves. And many suffering in silence that continue to suffer. I think the most dramatic thing that I've seen in Vietnam veterans is a fulminant case of post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's horrifying enough for a minute to have seen. It's got to be infinitely more horrifying to live with. And to the extent that these patients still continue to emerge, not only amazes me, but continually makes me understand understand what an incredibly disastrous move this was. It's very dramatic. You can be talking to an individual who's never been to the VA before, and if you press the right buttons, all of a sudden you have a massive jelly in your lap. It's almost like opening a small pimple and finding that you have an abscess underneath there the size of a baseball. And the amount of psychological pus and adrenaline, it's really scary. But that's not aging up.
Thank you, sir.